In San Antonio, Texas, on June 13th, 1994, it's a hot, sticky summer afternoon, the kind that makes everything feel heavier. The cicadas are buzzing, the pavement radiating heat, and somewhere in the suburbs, a 13-year-old boy named Nicholas Barkley is having a bad day. Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the downright eerie. Today's story is about a boy that vanished for years, but his return was far stranger than his disappearance. Nicholas was no stranger to trouble. He had already developed a bit of a reputation for being defiant and hot-tempered. He was the kind of kid who pushed back hard against authority. He lived with his mother, Beverly Dollarhide, and he'd been in and out of minor trouble with the law. Nothing major, but enough to say that this kid's life wasn't heading in the best direction. He was in trouble for things like truancy, petty theft, and arguments with the police that turned into screaming matches. That day, June 13th, Nicholas had gotten into another argument with his mother. Though they fought constantly, he still loved his mother. She was doing her best to raise him, and to some degree he understood that. But never being one to sit down and listen to authority, he just stormed out of the house, to cool off and get away for a while. His mother asked where he was going, and he just said he was heading to the basketball court, which was just a few blocks away. So as he walked out and slammed the door behind him, Beverly watched as he walked away in his white t-shirt, purple pants, and black sneakers. She wondered if he ever appreciated anything she had done for him, or if he ever would. But he always cooled off after a while and came home acting as if nothing had ever happened. That was sort of their dynamic. But that night, he didn't come home. At first, no one panicked. Nicholas had ran away before. It wasn't unusual for him to vanish for a day or two when he was angry, and like many parents of rebellious teens, Beverly assumed that he would be back when he cooled off, just like he always did. But days passed, then weeks, then 2, and no one heard from Nicholas. No friends, no phone calls, no sightings. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. The San Antonio police were called, but the case really didn't get much attention. He was labeled a runaway, and in the 90s, that often meant the case was put on the back burner. There were no Amber Alerts and no organized search parties, no national headlines. And so the file on Nicholas Barkley quietly collected dust. Just one more missing kid in a country full of them. But 3 years later, something impossible happened. In October of 1997, a phone rings at a police station in Linares, a small city in southern Spain. On the other end is a man claiming he's just found an American teenager, one who doesn't know who he is, doesn't have any ID, and who appears to be in shock. Authorities arrive and find a boy thin, quiet, and visibly shaken. He's hesitant to speak, but when he does, it's with a strange mix of accents. He tells them that his name is Nicholas Barkley. That Nicholas Barkley, the boy who vanished from Texas over 3 years ago. The Spanish police are stunned. It seems impossible. How could a missing American child end up alone on the streets of Linares? They contacted the U.S. authorities, who confirmed, yes, Nicholas Barkley is still missing. Within days, the story catches fire. The boy's placed in a shelter, and while officials scramble to verify his identity, the public is gripped by the story. A young man found halfway across the world, possibly rescued from an unspeakable ordeal. It was a miracle. Eventually, Nicholas is put on the phone with someone claiming to be from the U.S. Embassy. He tells his story in broken English. He says that he was kidnapped. He says he was held in a dark room and that there were other children and he was abused. He's vague on the details, but what he says sounds like something straight out of a nightmare. The U.S. contacts Nicholas' family in Texas. They're ecstatic to hear that he's alive, though devastated to hear what he's been through. They arrange a flight home immediately. As the day comes to greet Nicholas again, the family waits anxiously as the plane arrives in San Antonio. Passengers begin to file off one by one until finally there's Nicholas. As they see him, he's changed so much. He's older now, of course, 16 going on 17, but his eyes and hair are darker now, and through all of it, he's picked up a French accent. They excitedly greet him, but Nicholas is no longer this proud, fearless kid he used to be. Now he's quiet, more reserved, and he's jumpy. It's clear that what he's gone through was truly traumatic. Still, his sister hugs him, his mother welcomes him home, the family embraces him, and it seemed like their family was finally whole again. But with all of these differences, it didn't take long for doubts to start creeping in. Not from the family, but from outsiders. FBI agents, journalists, and one especially sharp-eyed private investigator named Charlie Parker began to take a closer look at this so-called miracle. Charlie was a former cop who was notoriously skeptical, and he noticed something strange right away. When he looked at Nicholas, he saw a different person. Not just older, but different in every way. The ears didn't match, the accent was off, and the eye color, the most obvious. Nick Barkley had bright blue eyes, and this boy, brown. Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He started asking questions, and when he did, the answers were vague, or just didn't make sense. The boy said that he had been kidnapped by a military sex trafficking ring that flew him between countries. He claimed that he was injected with drugs and his appearance was altered, even dyeing his hair. That's why he looked different. That's why he spoke differently. But the thing is, there was no proof, no medical records, no scars, no evidence of trauma. And here's where it gets weirder. The family, the people who should have known Nicholas best, didn't seem concerned. They didn't question the inconsistencies. They didn't even flinch at the wrong eye color. Why would a family accept a stranger into their home and call him their missing son? Unless they had something to hide. Charlie Parker brought his suspicion to the FBI, and finally a decision was made. They ran the boy's fingerprints. The results came back fast, and they were shocking. The boy wasn't Nicholas Barkley, but he was a 23-year-old Frenchman named Frederick Borden, a serial imposter wanted by Interpol, with a long history of pretending to be missing children. The family's reunion was a lie. The miracle was a fraud. But the biggest question still lingered. What really happened to the real Nick Barkley? Frederick Borden had been living a double or triple life long before he ever became Nicholas Barkley. Born in France in 1974, Borden grew up with a troubled past of his own. He was abandoned by his father and raised by grandparents who couldn't quite handle him. From an early age, he learned how to lie, how to mimic, and how to survive. He wasn't just pretending to be someone else. He was constantly running from who he really was. By the time he arrived in Spain and assumed Nicholas's identity, Frederick Borden had already posed as dozens of other children. Missing teenagers, orphans, or even fabricated identities entirely. He was a chameleon in the truest sense. He could fake an accent, change his hair, slouch to seem shorter, raise his voice to sound younger. He studied missing person databases and tailored his lies to fit the details. And his motive? It wasn't money. It wasn't fame. It was something much deeper. Something more disturbing. He once told investigators that he just wanted love, a family, and a place to belong. For someone to look at him and not see a monster. He had impersonated at least 500 different identities across Europe. Some for a day, some for weeks, and each one slipping through the cracks of overwhelmed systems and trusting hearts. And somehow, he always managed to disappear before things unraveled. Until now. This time he crossed a line. Pretending to be Nicholas Barkley brought him to the United States and into the arms of a grieving family. And for once, he stayed too long. He got too comfortable and gave investigators enough time to catch up. And after the truth came out, Borden was arrested and charged with perjury and passport fraud. He served 6 years in a U.S. prison, but even behind bars, his story wasn't over. Because once again, he was released and deported back to France. He did it again. He posed as even more missing boys. He invented new aliases, walked into schools claiming to be homeless teens. And every time he was discovered, he gave interviews, spun new lies, and vanished again. Frederick Borden wasn't just a con artist. He had an addiction to reinvention. And the damage he left behind wasn't just paperwork and confusion. It was trauma and betrayal. Families left shattered and re-traumatized. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all this, he might never have been caught if he hadn't chosen the wrong boy to impersonate. Once the truth about Frederick Borden came out, the world was stunned. But something about his story still didn't sit right. Because even after the lie was exposed, even after the fingerprints confirmed he was an imposter, Nicholas Barkley's family continued to stand by him. They said they believed him, said they forgave him. Some even claimed they still thought that he was Nicholas. But how could that be? How could a mother not recognize her own son? How could a sister not notice the wrong eye color, the different voice, the completely different person standing in front of her? Unless there was a reason they didn't want the truth to come out. Frederick Borden would later suggest that he wasn't the only one lying. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that Nicholas Barkley was dead long before he arrived in Texas, and that the family knew it. He said they accepted him not because they were fooled, but because they were afraid. Because if Nicholas were still missing, the case would stay open. Questions would be asked, and investigators might dig deeper, and they might find something that they weren't supposed to. Of course, there's no proof of that, no body, no confession, and no charges. But it raises a terrifying possibility. What if the only person telling the truth was the con artist? Nicholas Barkley was never found. His case remains unsolved, open, and cold. Frederick Borden went on to impersonate other children, give interviews, and even build a bit of an infamy for himself. He now lives in France, reportedly married with children. But the story he inserted himself into, the gaping hole where a boy once stood, remains. And it begs the question, was Frederick Borden just a manipulative fraud? Or did his greatest lie accidentally reveal a darker truth? And that's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. If you enjoyed today's story, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who loves an odd tale. Until next time, keep your eyes open and keep a lookout, because legends may live.